I'm Kirsten Kelly. I'm a documentary filmmaker living in Brooklyn and have a long history of working on social justice filmmaking and specifically a connection to stories having to do with youth and education. My former film, The Home Stretch that I made with my film partner, who's awesome, Anne Demare, um, she couldn't be with us today, but um, that film, The Homestretch, focused on three homeless high school students in the Chicago public school system, and we followed them over a course of 4 years as they graduated and kind of figured out their next steps. And one of the things that film won an Emmy, was on PBS, and it really changed the narrative around what does homeless youth or youth facing homelessness mean. One of the things that was really striking to both of us was just how deeply seated violence in the home was in each of their stories in various ways. And so when we were on the film festival circuit with that film, we met up with this amazing team who made this film called Private Violence, which kind of looked at that question around domestic violence of why doesn't she just leave? And really kind of broke that down and gave a new narrative around that. We loved that film. We loved that team. And they said, really, the next film that needs to happen in the sort of domestic violence, sexual assault narrative space is men standing up and caring and taking action on domestic violence, family violence, and it's not going to change without men leading that. And so they pointed us to this amazing gentleman here, Lieutenant Mark Wynn, who they said, hey, just go see this guy, meet this guy. He'll kind of give you a landscape and see, you might research where the story is. And when we went to see Mark, meet him and train for the first time, the profound sense of relief we felt that there was a man so deeply in this mission of working with other men, specifically, but law enforcement, court systems, and really from a childhood survivor perspective, deeply making change. And we were like, that's our next film. Mark, you. It didn't take much convincing. I don't know, did it?
Yeah, what was your feeling when you were approached to be the star of this film?
Kimmy, I was flattered beyond belief, and I saw Homestretch. I saw that, so I thought these are serious people, and I thought this is an opportunity. I do it on a small level where I'm trying to convince people about what's really going on with our kids and violence. There was a lot of possibilities here with a film like this to reach a bigger group of people, to convince them that we've got to start looking at the real problems. Today's violence, it's a wellspring of tomorrow's crime, basically.
Yes.
And the best way to do that is a megaphone, and they gave me a megaphone, and I couldn't turn that down.
I loved your film and I loved your story, Mark. Could you, and I'll have a link to the film so people can see it. Could you tell us a little bit about your story and how you ended up getting into the work you did?
It's not an unusual story, sad to say. 5 children, mother, abusive stepfather for 10 years. And from 5, I met the man at 4 or 5, and we got out when I was a teenager. My siblings, they were older than me. They left as soon as they got to be of age. My brother ran away from home at 16, joined the Marine Corps at 17, went to Vietnam at 18. And it was pretty serious abuse. He hospitalized her many times, nearly killed her several times, miscarriages twice from the abuse. And it just never stopped. I mean, it was, one of the things when I'm training police about this, about the cycle of violence, I've really stopped using the cycle of violence it's really on a continuum. It just goes and goes and goes. And these honeymoon phases don't exist for a lot of victims because offenders don't think they've done anything wrong. And that was my stepfather. He was a violent man who was raised by a violent man. So this is intergenerational. It's a heritage. It's ancestral. And it's, by the way, it's true in my family on my mother's side. I've done a lot of work in my ancestry, and I found, nowadays when you do ancestry work, you can find divorce filings of your family, and I found violent relatives on my mother's side as well. So it's a old story, but we're telling it a different way now. And that was an opportunity for me when I got into policing. My natural father was a cop and a judge, and I didn't grow up with him. We left him when I was a little boy. But when I became of age, I thought, I want to be like my father. I want to be a good man. And I got to that point because I had an unbelievable mother. I am my mother's son. She taught me how to be a good man. And I decided to get into policing. I was a reporter for about 3 years, and that gave me a heavy dose of, you got to make sure, do it right if you work in government, skepticism about government. So when I got into government work and law enforcement, as you see in the film, it was pretty clear that there was unbelievable problems with how we dealt with domestic violence, not only for the public, but for God's sakes, for our own police families. It was just horrible. It was like an open secret that, we hired violent men and we accepted their violence at home, and we accepted their deliberate indifference to families. Now we've changed, but it was a long battle of changing culture inside my own police department. And then I was lucky enough that I had a chief that was a survivor. He told me that after I told my command staff one day in a training that I'd survived, and he connected me with some of the national police organizations, and he put me on assignment, and I started working around the country. And next thing I know, I'm lecturing for the State Department around the world and training police chiefs and testifying before Congress. And I thought, my Lord, here this hillbilly cop is now talking about this. But I'll tell you, Kimmy, every time from the very beginning till today, every time I talk about this, I have other men come up and say, your story's my story. Yeah. So the film is bringing that out. And that's exactly what needs to happen. We have to stop ignoring it. And it wasn't easy, though. And I'll tell you this, I was accepted by the advocacy community. People like Barbara Hart and Joan Zorza and the people who helped write the Violence Against Women Act, Deb Tucker down in Texas. There's a ton of them. I mean, they just, Ellen Pence became a good friend of mine.
I feel like you're giving an Academy Award speech where you're like, who am I forgetting?
No, it is. And I hate to, because,
yeah.
I'm aware of this. I'm a man working in a field around violence against women. The last thing I would ever want to do as a man is to say, get a load of me. I'm a man. I'm here to talk about violence against women. When these women have been fighting for decades, I don't want to, take away something from them. I'm one of them. I'm a feminist. Or I'm pro-feminist. I can't be a pure feminist, not a woman. But the last thing I want to do is to say, now we're going to fix it because a man's here to fix it. That's stupid. So I have to tip my hat to the people who raised me. These advocates raised me. They brought me along to this point. I'm talking about a diamond in the rough.
People were listening to Mark, and Mark was able to get into these rooms and through these doors that, because he is such a trusted source and he has such a decorated, past in terms of law enforcement, people trust him. Getting in those spaces so intimately, small groups, large groups, urban, rural, mid-size, all over the country was happening. And we really wanted, we wanted to put the deep work in behind to get this film sort of amplified in to those spaces that, more spaces, new spaces, and to a general audience that needed to hear this message as well.
I'm curious what the response has been from domestic violent perpetrators. Like when you go into rooms, when you do these talks, like, is there a kind of like, I'm not even gonna guess what it is. Like, what is it? Like, how do you win the trust of someone who was a victim and has become now a perpetrator?
Wow. Well, I've had offenders in my classes. I've arrested police officers. I've convicted police officers. I've investigated police officers, FBI agents, Secret Service agents, federal probation officers, judges. This is the crime that is unusual when you look at all crimes that we deal with and historically we dealt with. This is the one where you will see your own involved at higher rates. I mean, we normally, if you have an officer who's stealing, the moment it's found out, you're out.
Right.
Or certainly if you're a bank robber or a drug dealer, you're gone. But there seemed to be a tolerance in our family for domestic violence and sexual violence. I'm talking about the police family.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So that has been another separate kind of a path to the work I'm doing in general around violence against women. But it's essential. My message is essential to police. If you are allowing violence in the family and police families, you as a leader or a police officer are colluding with a criminal. How much crime do you want your police to commit? And the answer has to be no.
Right.
So much is hinged on our honesty and our morals in policing, because and it makes perfect sense. And I know this because my wife was an advocate. And all my friends, it seems, are advocates. When you ask them, how do you know when is the best time to call the police if you're a crime victim, a domestic or sexual violence victim? And one of the things that often comes up is if I can trust them. And I'll say to a shelter director, and I've done this many times around the country, you got a police chief who's violent? Oh, absolutely. The sheriff, the chief. Do you trust that agency now? Because when you send somebody down the criminal justice route, if you can't trust that person to shepherd you through that system, it'll get you killed.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not melodrama. This is the reality. So there has to be a culture change, and we're getting there. And I'll give you an example. I did a 2-year study of Chicago police for the Civil Rights Division. And we discovered that there was an incredible amount of domestic and sexual violence going on inside the Chicago police. It's a big agency.
Yeah.
But there was a tolerance to it that seemed just unbelievable. Yeah. We put it in our findings. Chicago accepted it. Now they're changing their procedures, their hiring practices. They've recently just accepted sexual misconduct policy for all their personnel. That's the kind of thing that needs to happen. So we're still not in law enforcement, I don't think. We've got some work to do. We're still not hitting on all 8 cylinders around preventing violence against women because we've got problems in our own family. Once we solve that, then we can honestly tell victims, trust me, you can put your life in my hands. Right. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to protect your children. I'm not going to force you to do anything you don't want to do. I'm not going to look over you and say, you made your bed, sleep in it. I'm not going to ask you questions like, why did you stay? I already know it now. If it's a process, not an event, leaving. So this is the crime that really has a bigger impact on law enforcement than any other, because this is the source crime. This is the wellspring. This is where it all happens. it really came out in a survey. And forgive me for a long answer to a short
No,
question.
please. I'm like, tell me more. Yeah.
A good friend of mine, TK Logan, she's a professor at the University of Kentucky. She's a brilliant woman who studies the effectiveness of protective orders, and she's a stalking expert as well. She's created a tool for determining the dangerousness of stalkers for advocates. And Dr. Logan did a survey, a study on the domestic violence hotline in Austin. She interviewed women who called the hotline. And this was 2015 or 16, I think. And 80% of the women she talked to said they were still or somewhat afraid to call the police. 60% said they were still not convinced to share it with anybody. It was a private matter. 40% said that through retaliation. 20% said they thought they'd lose their children. And only 1 in 5 said they felt safer after they called the police. That's 2015, 16. That tells you still the reluctance of women. And all you have to do is look at the reportings of rape, because most rape's non-stranger. Most rapists know the victims. Most of it happens in the girlfriend, boyfriend, couples. That's where most of our rapes happen. And I think, the range is, 17% up to about 25%. So that means, upwards of more than 80% of women in communities don't report who've been raped. Right. That is a national disgrace. If we're playing a part in women not reporting, that's even worse, because you have to make the law keep its promise. So you can pass all the laws you want. The police have to be absolutely focused on that mission. And if we're doing things wrong and we're sending a signal to victims that it's not a big deal, then we're actually prepared. We're making sure the crime's committed in the future. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense. And from what I'm hearing is that you are not less interested, but where the focus is less on the reforming of the violence that's already there, and more on the tolerance shifting from the leadership, right? Like if you can change the tolerance shifting, change the hiring practices, basically like kind of get the violence out, then the law enforcement becomes a safer place for, Black men, safer place for women. I mean, just a safer place just in general, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
It is. There's a second part of this too. There's an incredible number of survivors in uniform already. Now, most don't go on to be violent men or women. But what I've noticed is most put it behind them and never say another word about it all their lives. And you can understand not wanting to walk back into your trauma.
Right.
That's you're already working in trauma every day.
Right.
Most cops in their career will experience over 100 really traumatic events, which brings on PTSD. Our suicide rates are high. Our divorce rates are high in policing. So it's already a tough enough job, but to ask survivors to say, let's start talking about our own history, it's a big ask, but I do it.
It seems like so much of what you're talking about, whether it's leadership or survivor, whether you're in a power position or not in a power position, that it all kind of comes down to trauma, right? Which comes down to mental health and access to the ability to heal. And I'd love to talk about some findings you've come across in terms of when that trauma happens, how it's handled, how it could be handled better.
Well, there's a couple of things around trauma, and I hate it that in the past, as a police investigator, I worked in homicide for years, which meant I worked a lot of police shootings, police-related shooting. And one of the things that I saw but didn't understand when I was doing reenactments of the shooting by the officers was fragmented memory. And it almost seemed like it was convenient for someone who was being deceptive. I couldn't remember a face. I didn't see the other person. I only fired my gun twice. There were things that seemed odd. I thought, how could you not be laser focused on every single minute piece of that moment because it's such a life and death situation? And when they couldn't remember, we would put in the report, they were lying. And the Canadians were the first to really catch on to this. God bless the Canadians. They're so advanced from us. And anyway, so they were looking at the neurobiology of trauma in Canada long before we were, by looking at these kind of moments of police trauma. Once we got it here in the U.S., that trauma has an impact on your memory physiologically. It has an impact on your cognitive abilities. It has all kinds of impacts. We're all sitting around as police educators going, wait a minute. If this happens with someone who is very well trained and focused to stay in control, knowing that they are going to be assaulted, knowing that they're going into dangerous situations, and they can't remember, what about a rape victim?
Yeah.
And you know what we were doing? Now we got it with cops. We let them go home for 3-4 days to sleep before we did the interview. Maybe their memory would come back in some sort of form. But we were doing immediate rape reports at hospitals, and the victim couldn't give us a good description of the offender. We'd write deceptive, unfounded, cleared case. So our ignorance actually fueled, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of rapes. And it's clear when you look at what happened with the untested rape kits around the country. There was 500,000. And I got involved in a project with the Justice Department to look at this issue. And it ended up, the SACI projects were created, that Sex Assault Kit Initiative projects were created after that. We looked at police reports from Detroit, and there was bias in the reporting, or just ignorance of trauma, which meant the rapists went on to rape other women. They caught, I think, 800 serial rapists out of Detroit once they caught on to what was going on. Cleveland caught over 100 serial rapists. So in that sense, the dangers of not understanding trauma are devastating to victims. So we started adding trauma into our work around this issue. So the language has evolved from, you would hear victimless prosecution, evidence-based prosecution. Now we're settling on trauma-informed, victim-centered approach.
Right.
It's an evolution. It's not that some of it didn't work in the past, but this is a better understanding of having that victim play a part in it, and then explaining to the victim, you may not be able to remember any of this. Don't stress. We got it. Mm-hmm. Cops can't remember who shot at them. You can't identify the guy who raped you.
Right.
Once we got that worked out, now you're starting to see an evolution in training around trauma. So that's a big part of it. And it's been a pretty amazing evolution, because I like to bring these two together. It's very much like officer safety. This is the most dangerous call police respond to. DV offenders have been killing U.S. police officers since the country was founded, and even before. But we never connected the dots that here's an offender who will kill you, protecting male privilege. And we'll talk about that if you like. So are we saying now that we're being hard on the victim for not leaving? In other words, this person will kill a cop, but when a victim says, I'm abused, the first thing we say is, well, why don't you just leave? Well, why don't the police just leave? Why don't you just hang your gun up, hang up your badge and leave? We're not going to do that either. So we have to understand that if an offender will assault, intimidate, coerce, all the things they do to victims, they'll do it to cops too, including kill cops. I've had 4 friends killed on domestics. And this is it kind of, if you did a diagram of this, in my mind, it would all kind of go right back to male privilege. And it's the, male privilege and violence is the engine that exposes children, that kills women. Every 18 months, we lose as many people killed in domestic violence we lost in 9/11. Some countries like Russia lose 25 women a day. The Brazilians lost 50,000 in the last 10 years. So we're talking about a worldwide epidemic of crimes against women fueled by a privilege that was set in place thousands of years ago. So my job is,
Question about that. I want to
yeah,
interrupt a second. And maybe this is a false premise I have, but one of the things that I have kind of integrated into our curriculum for young boys is thinking right now a lot of power and privilege is to have power and privilege over people, right? Like, I want to have power over you. That rape is often not sexual, but power, right? And so if people felt truly empowered and truly connected to themselves, would they need to have power over other people? And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. Like, you seem like a very psychologically healthy person, and you use your power for good, your privilege for good. You share power, share resources, and that to me feels like where we need to be going psychologically. And so I'm just wondering about that because, yes, it's privilege, but also to me, it smacks of powerlessness.
well, you're right. And you're not born violent. That you know, there may be a study one day that proves that, but I've never seen it. There's got to be you got to program the computer basically, and the way these young men are being programmed is, I think the environment itself is dangerous. Obviously, society, social media, it's constant drumbeat of objectification of women. It's just all those things. But the stronger source is in the home, obviously. And that's where you learn to walk and talk and socialize, and where you learn to love or not love, and what's more important to you. And then you learn that those moments where power becomes something that you're going to get, whether anybody likes it or not. This is when we see this in homicide. This is when men who kill will kill while they're losing power.
Yeah.
Not while they've got it. Everything's okay now, right? When they're losing power, that's when they start killing. So the need for that power and that privilege is a narcotic,
Right.
and you got to have it. Detoxing is not an easy thing to do, but when you provide children with an alternative, and what you're doing is exactly what I tell communities all around the country. You've got to replace that void there. You've got to have a moment where a man or a woman says to a boy or a girl, let's talk about how we treat one another. Let's talk about the power of love, not fear.
Mm-hmm.
And if you replace it, you give them an alternative, you have a chance. I was never given that chance other than my mother.
Right.
But I'm talking to advocates now around the country who are in middle school and elementary and high school doing things like you're doing. Dr. Bruce Perry, who I'm a big fan of, who's a neurologist and child psychologist down at Baylor. He's got a whole institute on this. He's been studying brain development of children who are exposed to violence. And I've heard him lecture many times. I use a lot of his material in my trainings at police. And he says that the child more likely to be violent and later in life is the ones exposed early in life at 10, 12 months old. Because that's, again, where your brain is developing, whether you socialize or can speak or not, you're exposed to that violence. And he's proved it through brain scans of children. Because your brain is spongier in those early 3 or 4 years of childhood. In the past, we would tell police, we didn't even understand any of that. We weren't talking about it. In policing, we were telling officers, you ever been on a call where you saw a little boy who was violent with their parents or hitting their sister or their mother? Why? You were investigating a domestic violence call? This is the stuff that shelters see too, by the way.
Yeah.
And they'd say, yeah. I said, well, there you go. You're looking at 2 generations in one frame. You're seeing the child who's now demonstrating what they're going to be for your officers after you retire.
Right.
And that was acceptable. But now we're telling officers that's much younger that it's that infant. Now, and by the way, parallel to this is what Dr. Anda at the CDC, and I've met him several times. He's a brilliant man, and his research partner, Vanali, I'm sorry, forgive me, I forget his last name. They were both cancer researchers. The CDC asked them to create the adverse childhood experience test over 20 years ago. And I think they're tracking about 16,000 people through their adult life of what happens to you when you're exposed to violence at those early ages that Dr. Perry has talked about. They're looking at drug abuse, cervical cancer, alcohol, violence, suicide, and the ACE test sort of parallels with what Dr. Perry is saying, that brain, that child brain, is a precious thing that's being assaulted. It should be in my mind, it should be a felony to assault the brain of an infant.
Right.
Because you may be locking in a criminal for the future, if that makes any sense.
It does. And when you said that you were exposed to your stepfather's violence before, it sounds like you didn't experience violence at that crucial age.
Well, I mean, when you're
At the
desperate.
10-month age.
Yeah. Well, I think I met him when I was 4, maybe 5. So I was spared that development, but that wasn't a guarantee. And I think when I was 7, my brother and I, at least this is in the film, we tried to kill my stepfather.
Right.
And thank God he didn't die, because if he had, we wouldn't be doing this interview.
Right.
So that's the other thing that I talk to police and others about is this is much, much bigger than you realize. When you stand back and look at the criminal element in our society, this is the wellspring. This is where it all starts. If you really want to save our society a lot of money in corrections and criminal justice and pain and suffering, we've got to invest in programs like what you're doing. That's the smart move.
Mm-hmm.
And until we do that, we're just putting our finger in the broken down. We're not really getting to the source.
Circling back to, responses of the film and the sort of message and the story arc of the film, like one of the things, we had about 60 expert advocate law enforcement people review it, like as we were creating the engagement campaign and where, how to approach the outreach of this. And, one of the things that kept coming back was, this being very rare to have a film or a piece of media around this very traumatic subject, this very traumatic issue, that was actually hopeful. Like seeing the arc of someone who came out of that, environment and didn't become a criminal, didn't, you know, forward that sort of cycle. It was breaking that cycle was really important, in terms of child advocacy work, in terms of domestic violence advocacy work, that seeing Mark's narrative and what he's, taking his pain and doing something really powerful in the world, in working with, abuser education groups, that is a really powerful story to sort of watch and share in the room. Like, you don't have to continue on this path. You can, look at examples like this. And I think that's one of the things that kept coming back in terms of, taking that trauma-informed approach in Mark's journey as trauma-informed, and yet providing this really hopeful, way forward.
Right. That change is possible. That
Yeah.
it's kind of like throw your hands up in the air, which a lot of people do with the boys will be boys, biology is
Yeah.
destiny, like, fuck it, we can't do anything,
Right.
right? And it's like, but we can. And how are we going to do that? So have you had any pushback on the film? Like, have you had any, yeah, like any, I can't imagine any negative response, right? Because I just think it's such important work. And Mark, you're so incredible. But I'm just wondering if you've had any unexpected responses.
Yeah, I think there's always, we kind of knew this from the team, our colleagues and friends who worked on the private violence film, you know, storytelling in this space in terms of domestic violence, sexual assault, um, it's hard to get audiences in.
Right.
Once we've really tried to position it as a hopeful film about a dark subject because, and that's also why we specifically made it shorter. Like we didn't want to do a 90-minute to 2-hour trauma documentary.
I
We
love
want
that about it. Yeah, it felt like
right,
it can handle this. Right.
handle it. And then we've also, had survivor, statistically survivors are going to be in that room whenever, when watching the film. And so how do you take care of that? And, we've had people come to us and say, thank you for not, trying to making us live through these details of trauma so deeply, or recreations, or like you chose to tell it through this this one man's memory in a way where he was at a point where a lot of that trauma had been dealt with and figured out in his life. It wasn't a dangerous moment. So I think we consciously tried to hold that audience when we were editing in our hands in a really strong way. Because the alternative is, this kind of work can tip over into, look at true crime, right? This is just a whole industry that is exploding around stories of killing women.
Right.
And it's horrific. And it's like, people are like, well, why don't you guys go work in TV? And it's like, we don't want to work on those stories.
Feel like I don't want any part of that.
I
Right.
feed that beast, and
It goes back to the
so
desensitization and the tolerance,
yep.
and the removal, right, from the reality of it. Like people can binge watch true crime, and they're like, that happens to someone else. I read Gavin de Becker's The Gift of Fear when I was in my 20s, and I just loved that book so much.
And
But
Mark is in that book.
oh, I don't think I knew that. That's
And
amazing.
Gavin is
Love
an
that book.
executive, he's an executive producer of
Oh
the
my
film.
God. Yeah, I love,
So
love, love
full
that,
circle.
love that book. It was so helpful. But one of the things I remember reading was people think it's going to happen to someone else. People are always like, oh, someone else. It's never going to happen to me, and that kind of otherizing that happens, I think is really dangerous. What's some advice you'd give to parents of boys who want to raise boys differently?
I think for me, it's modeling.
Yeah.
Um, Having your children see you be kind and loving to people who are not as fortunate as you. And it could be something as, having your kids share in a charity, or helping a homeless person, or volunteering, to do a social program, introducing your kids to people who you are who models for you. It's showing them kindness and the power of kindness versus the power of hatred. It's explaining racism and homophobia and misogyny and bigotry. Those are some foundational things. I think I think your kids will see it. That, my goodness, this is my mom and dad. We may be white and privileged, but we understand our country. We understand what racism is. We understand. It's like the first time I read Cash, and I'm sure a lot of people have read it. The book had already been written for me years ago, because I completely understand male privilege, and what male privilege is. What white male privilege is oppression, and the opposite of that is to show your children what how damaging that can be. So modeling for your kids. It's like modeling for in law enforcement. I tell my my sergeants when I was a lieutenant. I said, you got to model for these young officers, show them what a kind, caring, just, moral cop looks like. And I think it's the same with children.